Well, this is week 10 of our Nehemiah series. Just 3 more weeks to go after this. However, just let me give you a heads up. I've got a family wedding on the 5th of December. So actually the final week is now going to be on the 12th. But anyway, I hope you were able to join with us last Sunday for the baptism service of Ali. I mean, what a day that was. It was so good to celebrate. But in amongst that, let's have that little reality check. There was the celebration, but in Nehemiah 9, we were once again in that place of sober confession and actually remembering how far we've come, but actually how faithful our God is, even though we may mess up many times. We say that saying, don't we? God is always for us. And actually, when we enter into that, when we repent and we come back to Him, and I think by way of a summary, just further summary to complete that whole picture of last week, just because God is always for us, it doesn't mean that life isn't without its consequences. So we need to walk that narrow path in obedience and faith. Otherwise, there are implications. We have those scars, don't we? And sometimes terminal consequences. So we need to take our sins seriously. And as we saw before in previous Nehemiah messages, we need to keep that armour on as we serve God. Remember, if you think back to that sword and the trowel message, we need both things. And actually, if we're not good at remembering, then it's good practice to write things down. So when we find ourselves sometimes in those lost moments, we can remember, we can look back and we can remember, can't we, what direction we said we wanted to go. Now you can call this a pledge or a covenant. That's kind of the language that I will be using for the message today. Because this is what we read. If you were to flick back to the end of Nehemiah 9, there are the details that they're coming to here in chapter 10. And they made this pledge. You've had that reading already. So let's dive into our passage today. You know, the people in our passage, they are making that covenant. They're making a pledge. And I don't know about you, a helpful definition for me of a covenant is to cut an agreement or cut a deal. You know, in the Old Testament, when a covenant is made, it literally involves sacrificing or the cutting of something. Now that was usually an animal or bunch of animals, and it had a real cost to it. You know, whenever a life is taken, it is a serious matter. So when the people were entering into a covenant, you know, this agreement with God is serious. Now bring that home for a minute. I wonder when we make our pledges or our promises to God, what are we prepared to sacrifice when we enter into those places? So to be specific, what do you say? What do I say to God when we want to covenant, maybe over a particular sin in our lives? What sort of sacrifice are we prepared to say to God? I am serious about this. What are we going to do? What are we going to say? What promises or sacrifices do we make in that moment? Now, I know this is a personal thing. We landed on that quite quickly. But what we see in our passage today is something collective where everyone has come together to make a covenant. You know, we have recorded, and if you look there in your Bibles, we have about 84 leaders who have all put their seal on the covenant before God. And it was the leaders here who stepped up. They recorded first saying, this is the way we are going. Now, I don't know about you, but that reminded me of something in the news, probably something quite topical this week, the COP26 summit. And of course, that's looking at climate change, isn't it? And it's attended by the world leaders and others. I think it's totally recorded about 30,000 people, I think, are involved all throughout. And they're looking to sign agreements to keep, and this is what it's all about, isn't it? Temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius and above those 2 degrees Celsius above those pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, many people see it as actually one of the most significant climate events since that 2015 Paris Agreement. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of that this morning and where you're at with that, but I think what we're looking at here, the principles are quite interesting. Because agreements or plans were made in the past about climate control and stuff, aren't they? More agreements and plans are being made now. And let's be fair, if it doesn't quite work out or folk mess up or they're unable to do what they say they're going to do, then no doubt there are going to be future meetings and pledges that follow. And it's really similar to the patterns that we saw back in Nehemiah 9. You know, it's the same old patterns or distractions that can impact or direct our lives so much. Now, as we saw last time, the Jews in Nehemiah 9 were remembering things that were based around covenants. I found a good quote on this just to kind of sum up Nehemiah 9, and it says, God made a covenant with Abraham, promising that both a nation and the Messiah would descend from him. God made a covenant with Moses and the nation of Israel when he gave them the law at Mount Sinai. God made a covenant with King David, promising the Messiah would come from his family. But the greatest covenant, the new covenant instituted by the Messiah, was yet to come. And this is where we are here, aren't we? And I think with all these covenants, what we saw was a people who willingly entered into these agreements. But instantly, and it almost seemed, didn't it, from that position of strength and wealth and blessing, they're in a good place, not hardship. It's in those moments that they seem to turn away from the covenants that they've made. Now, it seems impossible, doesn't it? But it still goes on today. There is nothing new under the sun. So now, here in chapter 10, not only do we have the list of these 84 influential leaders or people's names who seal this new covenant, but all the people were involved. You have a look there, chapter 10 and verse 28. The priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, musicians, temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighbouring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters, also made the covenant with God. So how does this apply to us today then? Whether that's here at Limbrick Wood or in other churches if you're listening online. Well, the point we can take away is this. It is the responsibility of everyone who is church, not comes to church, but is church, that makes up that body. We must all take part in that. You know, it's not just about saying, oh, we leave that to the leaders or the pastors, and there is a place for them and associations to help that, but we're all part of it. And I think we must have that united mindset that we have demonstrated here. Now, this means it's the privilege and the duty of everyone to help church to function. Now, we have a saying, don't we, in the Baptist church, to discern the mind of Christ, to take part and to serve. And as a family, you guys know we're going to be moving on from LWBC early next year. But our roles and duties should not go away. They shouldn't come to an end. They're there for others to pick up and run with, probably even further than we did. You know, it's not a time to back away from church. But like the Jews here in Nehemiah 10, it's a time to step up and choose to be part of the next steps. And this is what they did. This is what they were pledging or covenanting that we're reading today. Now, remember last week when I mentioned about the promises we make. Now, probably when we make those promises, almost certainly, we don't pray like this. God curse me if I mess it all up. Now, why is that? Well, probably because I think we all know we will mess up. Of course, we're living under grace, but it may be that actually living under that grace, it comes to a place where we say, well, I'm not going to overcommit to something and speak like that that's going to come back and maybe bite me. Let's look here in verse 29 as to what the people did. This is in Nehemiah 10, verse 29. All these now join their fellow Israelites, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord, our Lord. Now, I don't know about you, but that's huge, isn't it? It's a huge promise. And probably from such a high place, it's such a huge fall. Now, I don't know about you, I don't want to live that kind of roller coaster life, where we're on those mountaintop highs and then we're in those deepest, darkest valleys. But here they were. And from verse 30 onwards, they're making promises again. And there's some specific declarations. Now, I think really, just to break this down, wind this up towards the end, they're going to fit into 3 areas really well. So we're going to briefly look at each area, and these are being their home life and relationships, that's their work and business, and finally how they support the church, or supporting the church and God's work. So let's look at number 1. Their first pledge or covenant is around their home life and relationships. Now, it's worth remembering that back in the day, Nehemiah's day, they had arranged marriages. So this is a family thing that they're pledging here. It's the parents saying that they would do things differently. Now, we recognise the importance of a Christian being wed or married to another Christian. It just makes things so much more simple to be married to someone who not only gets what God is saying to you, but they're actually also instrumental in leading each of us, or leading us on into those places too. So the Jews here are saying we recognise the importance of not going off and marrying whoever we choose. And actually, for whatever gain, that might be why they were getting married overseas in a sense. God is calling us, or calling them and us, to a purity here. And it has many benefits and many blessings. Now, for us as parents today, we don't get to choose a spouse for our kids. It's nice when a hand is requested in marriage, and there is still some of that tradition alive. But I know many faithful Christians, and probably thinking about this, it was mainly ladies who have married nice men, or maybe men that are considered to be good, but they're not Christians. And while all the signs were there that they're saying, hey, these guys, they're great and they're just on the edge, they're only one step away from coming to faith, for a majority of them, they've never arrived at that place. And I think probably that phrase, good versus purpose, comes up again, doesn't it? For a lot of these ladies, a lot of these friends that I know, they've never reached their full calling because of who they married. Now, to paint a picture in our minds of this, I like pictures, as you know. We've had a lot of family birthdays here recently, and there have been quite a few of these helium-filled balloons that have popped up in our house. Now, to stop them hitting the ceiling, they have a weight tied onto the end of their string. Now, that balloon will only ever be able to fly as high as that string will let it be. And actually, over the weeks, eventually, that balloon loses its helium and it sinks back down to the ground where that weight is. Now, I've seen a lot of marriages that are like that, where only one party was the active Christian. And it's a bit like that picture. Kind of all the hot air, or whatever it is, the helium goes and it sinks down. But we know, don't we? If we have the balloon that doesn't have a weight tied to its string to weigh it down, well, don't let go of it outside, because it is going to rise up into the sky. And actually, have a couple of those balloons together, well, they will rise up and fly high, and they will support each other. And I think that's the point that's being made here in verse 30. As Christians, we know marriage is a covenant between two people. And while society today likes to erode that and reshape marriage into all sorts of things, for the Christian, marriage is a covenant made before God to draw closer to God. And you'll have heard this before. I've probably shared it a few times now. But as I share with folk about weddings, there's that picture of a triangle, isn't there? With the husband and the wife at each of the bottom corners. And actually, as they draw closer to God, who's at the top, ultimately as they draw up, they naturally get closer to each other too. I suppose a picture or a shape for the non-Christian marriage, or if there's no God in that, it's a bit like a train track running off into the distance. You could say it looks a bit like a triangle, doesn't it, with perspective? But the reality is this, isn't it? The train tracks never actually meet. And sadly, this is the case with a lot of marriages. And it's both Christians and non-Christians. If God is not in your corner, so to speak, and they are not pursuing God together, then things can go awry. Let me quote this to you again. I like some of these quotes I found as I was doing my research today. It says this: when we understand marriage as a covenant, we have something to bond us together that is stronger than society's expectations, more constant than romantic love, and more certain than happy times. We have a covenant. Isn't that beautiful? Now let's look at the second thing that they pledge here. And this relates really to, I think, to work and business is a good way of summing this up. You actually look in verse 31. They agree that they will not trade on the Sabbath. Now this relates, of course, directly to the fourth commandment, remembering the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. And now they are, of course, being very serious about keeping the law. They've heard it, it's been explained to them, and therefore this is one of those laws. We must do it. It is written. So it makes sense, especially as Nehemiah also had sorted the gates out, we said in previous chapters, and kind of meant that trading on the Sabbath, it's a big deal breaker here. So this is for them is quite a big one. But why were they trading anyway? Well, I'm pretty sure it's an overriding factor. It's more than an overriding factor or a necessity. We kind of go through those things where we say, well, hang on, more work means more money. But it's looking at heart attitudes, isn't it? Their heart attitude should be towards God, and it should be more important than money. Comes back to good versus purpose. It drops in again, doesn't it? And while it may make good sense to work more, we've got to pay the bills, we've got to feed the family. There may be those little luxuries that we're saving up for, which is all good stuff, isn't it? But actually, what is our purpose? Our purpose is to glorify God. So when we put our needs and our wants above our purpose, and like I said, they could be all good things, then we're missing out. So the people promised, didn't they? Verse 31, you have a look. They say, when the neighbouring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. And then it kind of continues even more so, doesn't it? Every 7th year we will forgo working the land and will cancel all debts. Now there's a lot to unpick in there, and I'd love to kind of unpick some of that today, but I don't want to disappear off down a rabbit hole. Maybe something you can look at on that pattern of every 7 years. But look, they wrest even their land, and money, debt, has no hold over them, so that every 7 years their debts are cancelled. Money is not their master. But this is such a far cry from the world of today, isn't it? I think almost everyone, apart from the super rich, are in some sort of debt. Come on, even our countries and governments are. So what hope do we have? Well, we look to God, don't we, for his wisdom over our finances. And I'm going to pick up maybe briefly on that at the end and give you a tip at the end. But let's look at the third part here to their pledge or their covenant. And this is how they went about supporting the church and God's work. And that's verses 32 through to 39. Actually, look at the last part of verse 39. What do they say? We will not neglect the house of our God. It says it right there at the end, that last bit of verse 39. What we start to see here are even more specific details. There are taxes to support the temple. And they're signing up to these, remember? They speak of tithes and offerings. And these are not old bits of fruit and stuff that they have lying around. I say, hey, just pop that up at the temple with you because we won't use it anyway. And look, actually, it's a bit off. It's a bit rotten. Or it's take that animal over there. It's got a dodgy leg anyway. No, these are the first fruits, which was risky because the land or the animals might not produce any more stuff. Now let's be clear on the principle here. God always gets the first fruits. And he promises, doesn't he? We've seen it throughout the scriptures. He promises a blessing in return. Now this is a faith and a trust step, isn't it? Whatever the outcome, God, we trust you. And their covenant wanted them to remember that. Of course, money can control us. And we've said this before. Or we control it. Our attitude towards our money shows where our heart is at. Jesus says this, taught this a lot. And again, it came up in messages a few weeks back. Remember God, he is the great giver of all things. And we've got to ask ourselves, are we givers like God? Now, the New Testament speaks, I think, with real clarity here on the principle of giving. And that our giving should be regular, it should be planned, it should be proportional, and it's private. Look it up, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through to 14. And that it must be generous, freely given, and from a cheerful giver. Love that verse. 2 Corinthians 9. You must have heard that saying before. We can't outgive God. And it's true. Thing is, the return that he gives us is not necessarily money. It's actually far better than that. So, what is our takeaway today? Well, I think the question is, are we prepared to put our words and promises into action like the Jews are here in Nehemiah 10? We've almost actually, haven't we, gone full circle to the beginning of Nehemiah. Remember when we're picking about plans, the best laid plans? Our plans are fine with our enemies as long as they don't become action plans. And I think it's the same with covenants or a promise. It's fine just as long as it's going to be a broken promise. So, how do we apply the things that we've actually looked at this morning into our lives? Well, I'm going to give you another one-word answer. Are you ready for it? And it's not God or Jesus this time. This is the word specific. Be specific. I've actually said it a number of times throughout the message this morning. And actually, by being specific, when we're specific about something, we can take that response and say, I want you to be more specific about that. And then actually, once again, after that, we refine the second response and we can be even more specific. That has an action. Did you catch it? I hope you didn't miss that. 3 stages of refinement here. Number 1, be specific. Number 2, be more specific. And number 3, be even more specific and with an action. Now, let me try and give you a couple of examples that we can maybe put through those 3 stages of refinement. If we were to specifically say, first stage here, I want to honour God more in my relationships, or I want to honour God more in my finances. That's a really good start, isn't it? But it might not be specific enough. So the refinement comes in number 2. Be more specific. Okay. Well, the first point there, I need to work on setting aside more time to be with my family. Or the other one, I need to look at the family budget so I can work out what I could say commit to giving to the church or whatever it is that you give to. It's better, isn't it? But it's still not specific enough. So refinement number 3. This is what we could do with this. I have blocked out Tuesday and Friday nights in my diary so that my family and my friends has my full attention. And that's spot on, isn't it? And maybe our other example, this Wednesday evening, we can't do Tuesday and Friday. This Wednesday evening, I'm going to look through the family budget and come up with a giving plan that we can commit to and put a timescale on it, realistic, commit to, say, for the next 3 months. Now, my points here aren't about money and people and stuff, just 2 examples. But actually, the principle is what I've found over the years, if that we can get things specific and specifically in our diary, then there's more chance that they will happen. And if we're saying, look, we want to honour God more in our relationships and whatever it might be, those things that you come up with this morning, then putting those things in our diary as those immovable stones, I'm almost certain you will get them done. If we're trying to convince ourselves, and I hear this through a lot of Christians sometimes, I'm that free spirit, I'm led by the Holy Spirit. If that's the kind of thinking, I think sometimes we're being deceived, because I think the only spirit that will lead us, especially in today's busy world, is the spirit of distraction or procrastination. It's as if we say, well, I'll do the God stuff if nothing better comes along. And the reality is, nothing better always comes along, and we end up doing the nothing better stuff. We actually end up doing nothing instead of doing the something for God. Now, like the Jews in our passage today, they wrote things down. So I would say for you and me, hey, look, it's a great personal exercise. Have a think about your spiritual priorities and goals and those steps that you need to take to achieve them. Even if they're 5-year plans, there will be a step that you need to take to start on that journey. And I'm emphasizing that word you, it's also me as well, because this is something that we need to apply to ourselves and not look to others. Because our plans shouldn't be dependent on or distracted by others either. That there's a reason these guys wrote things down and made their covenants. So I encourage you, go find a quiet place this week. Write those things down maybe that have come to mind throughout this message today, and covenant with God. It might be some sacrifice involved in that, but covenant it with God and apply it personally. And above all, just be specific, be very specific. Put it in your diary. If that's how it works, put it in your diary. And let's see what happens. Let's covenant with God. Let's bless God. Let's remember our purpose. God bless you too.